Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Down the chocolate river. Off we go, cried Mr. Wonka. Hurry up, everybody. Follow me to the next room. And please, don't worry about Augustus Gloop. He's bound to come out in the wash. They always do. We shall have to make the next part of the journey by boat. Here she comes. Look! A steamy mist was rising up now from the great, warm chocolate river, and out of the mist there appeared suddenly a most fantastic pink boat. It was a large open rowboat with a tall front and tall back, like a Viking boat of old, and it was of such a shining, sparkling, glistening pink color that the whole thing looked as though it were made of bright pink glass. There were many oars on either side of it, and as the boat came closer, the watchers on the river bank could see that the oars were being pulled by masses of Oompa Loompas. At least 10 of them to each oar. "This is my private yacht," cried Mr. Wonka, beaming with pleasure. "I made her by hollowing out an enormous boiled sweet. Isn't she beautiful? See how she comes cutting through the river." The gleaming pink boiled sweet boat glided up to their riverbank. 100 Oompa Loompas rested on their oars and stared up at the visitors. Then suddenly, for some reason best known to themselves, they all burst into shrieks of laughter.
What's so funny?
"What's so funny?" asked Violet Beauregard. "Oh, don't worry about them," cried Mr. Wonka. "They're always laughing. They think everything's a colossal joke. Jump into the boat, all of you. Come on, hurry up." As soon as everyone was safely in, the Oompa Loompas pushed the boat away from the bank and began to row swiftly downriver. "Hey, there! Mike TV!" shouted Mr. Wonka. "Please do not lick the boat with your tongue. It'll only make it sticky." "Daddy," said Veruca Salt, "I want a boat like this. I want you to buy me a big, pink, boiled sweet boat exactly like Mr. Wonka's. And I want lots of Oompa Loompas to row me about. And I want a chocolate river. And I want... "She wants a good kick in the pants," whispered Grandpa Joe to Charlie. The old man was sitting in the back of the boat, and little Charlie Bucket right beside him. Charlie was holding tightly onto his grandfather's bony old hand. He was in a whirl of excitement. Everything he had seen so far, the great chocolate river, the waterfall, the huge sucking pipes, the candy meadows, the Oompa Loompas, the beautiful pink boat, and most of all, Mr. Willy Wonka himself, had been so astonishing that he began to wonder whether there could possibly be any more astonishments left. Where were they going now? What were they going to see? And what in the world was going to happen in the next room? "Isn't it marvelous?" said Grandpa Joe, grinning at Charlie. Charlie nodded and smiled up at the old man. Suddenly, Mr. Wonka, who was sitting on Charlie's other side, reached down into the bottom of the boat, picked up a large mug, dipped it into the river, filled it with chocolate, and handed it to Charlie.
"Here, try some of this. It'll do you good."
"Drink this," he said. "It'll do you good. You looked starved to death."
"We look starved to death."
Then Mr. Wonka filled a second mug and gave it to Grandpa Joe. "You too," he said. "You look like a skeleton." "What's the matter? Hasn't there been anything to eat in your house lately?" "That's kind of rude." "Not much," said Grandpa Joe. Charlie put the mug to his lips, and as the rich, warm, creamy chocolate ran down his throat into his empty tummy, his whole body from head to toe began to tingle with pleasure, and a feeling of intense happiness spread over him. "You like it?" asked Mr. Wonka. "Oh, it's wonderful," Charlie said. "The creamiest, loveliest chocolate I've ever tasted," said Grandpa Joe, smacking his lips. "That's because it's been mixed by a waterfall," Mr. Wonka told him. The boat sped on down the river. The river was getting narrower. There was some kind of a dark tunnel ahead, a great round tunnel that looked like an enormous pipe. And the river was running right into the tunnel, and so was the boat. "Row on!" shouted Mr. Wonka, jumping and waving his stick in the air. "Full speed ahead!" And with the Oompa Loompas rowing faster than ever, the boat shot into the pitch-dark tunnel, and all the passengers screamed with excitement. "How can they see where they're going?" shrieked Violet Beauregard in the darkness. "There's no knowing where they're going!" cried Mr. Wonka, hooting with laughter.
There's no earthly way of knowing which direction they are going. There's no knowing where they're rowing or which way the river's flowing. Not a speck of light is showing. So the danger must be growing, for the rowers keep on rowing, and they're certainly not showing any signs that they are slowing.
"He's gone off his rocker!" shouted one of the fathers, aghast, and the other parents joined in the chorus of frightened shouting. "He's crazy!" they shouted. "He's balmy! He's nutty! He's screwy! He's batty! He's dippy! He's dotty! He's duffy! He's goofy! He's beany! He's buggy! He's wacky! He's loony!" "No, he is not," said Grandpa Joe. "Switch on the lights!" shouted Mr. Wonka, and suddenly on came the lights and the whole tunnel was brilliantly lit up, and Charlie could see that they were indeed inside a gigantic pipe, and the great upward curving walls of the pipe were pure white and spotlessly clean. The river of chocolate was flowing very fast inside the pipe, and the Oompa Loompas were all rowing like crazy, and the boat was rocketing along at a furious pace. Mr. Wonka was jumping up and down in the back of the boat and calling to the rowers to row faster and faster still. He seemed to love the sensation of whizzing through a white tunnel in a pink boat on a chocolate river, and he clapped his hands and laughed and kept glancing at his passengers to see if they were enjoying it as much as he. "Look, Grandpa!" cried Charlie. "There's a door in the wall." It was a green door, and it was set into the wall of the tunnel just above the level of the river. As they flashed past it, there was just enough time to read the writing on the door. "Storeroom number 54, it said. All the creams. Dairy cream, whipped cream, violet cream, coffee cream, pineapple cream, vanilla cream, and hair cream." "Hair cream?" cried Mike Teavee. "You don't use hair cream?" "Row on!" shouted Mr. Wonka. "There's no time to answer silly questions." They streaked past a black door. "Storeroom number 71, it said on it. Whips, all shapes and sizes." "Whips?" cried Veruca Salt. "What on earth do you use whips for?" "For whipping cream, of course," said Mr. Wonka. "How can you whip cream without whips? Whipped cream isn't whipped cream at all, unless it's been whipped with whips. Just as a poached egg isn't a poached egg unless it's been stolen from the woods in the dead of the night. Row on, please." They passed a yellow door on which it said, "Storeroom number 77. All the beans, cacao beans, coffee beans, jelly beans, and has-beens." "Has-beens!" cried Violet Beauregard. "You're one yourself," said Mr. Wonka. "There's no time for arguing. Press on, press on." But 5 seconds later, when a bright red door came into sight ahead, he suddenly waved his gold-topped cane in the air and shouted, "Stop the boat!" The Inventing Room, Everlasting Gobstoppers, and Hair Toffee. When Mr. Wonka shouted, "Stop the boat!" the Oompa Loompas jammed their O's into the river and backed water furiously. The boat stopped. The Oompa Loompas guided the boat alongside the red door. On the door it said, "Inventing Room, Private, Keep Out." Mr. Wonka took a key from his pocket, leaned over the side of the boat, and put the key in the keyhole. "This is the most important room in the entire factory," he said. "All my most secret new inventions are cooking and simmering in here." Old Fickergruber would give his front teeth to be allowed inside just for 3 minutes. So would Prodnose and Slugworth and all the other rotten chocolate makers. But now, listen to me. I want no messing about when you go in. No touching, no meddling, and no tasting. Is that agreed? "Yes, yes," the children cried. "We won't touch a thing." "Up to now," Mr. Wonka said, "nobody else, not even an Oompa Loompa, has ever been allowed in here." He opened the door and stepped out of the boat into the room. The 4 children and their parents all scrambled after him. "Don't touch!" shouted Mr. Wonka. "And don't knock anything over!" Charlie Bucket stared around the gigantic room in which he now found himself. The place was like a witch's kitchen. All about him, black metal pots were boiling and bubbling on huge stoves, and kettles were hissing and pans were sizzling, and strange iron machines were clanking and spluttering, and there were pipes running all over the ceiling and walls, and the whole place was filled with smoke and steam and delicious rich smells. Mr. Wonka himself had suddenly become even more excited than usual, and anyone could see that this was the room he loved best of all. He was hopping about among the saucepans and the machines like a child among his Christmas presents, not knowing which thing to look at first. He lifted the lid from a huge pot and took a sniff. Then he rushed over and dipped a finger into a barrel of sticky yellow stuff and had a taste. Then he skipped across to one of the machines and turned half a dozen knobs this way and that. Then he peered anxiously through the glass door of a gigantic oven, rubbing his hands and cackling with delight at what he saw inside. Then he ran over to another machine, a small shiny affair that kept going, and every time it went, a large green marble dropped out of it into a basket on the floor. At least it looked like a marble. "Everlasting gobstoppers!" cried Mr. Wonka proudly. Violet Beauregard is soon to turn into a giant blueberry. "They're completely new. I am inventing them for children who are given very little pocket money. You can put an everlasting gobstopper in your mouth, and you could suck it and suck it and suck it and suck it and suck it, and it will never get any smaller." "It's like gum," cried Violet Beauregard. "It is not like gum," Mr. Wonka said. "Gum is for chewing, and if you tried chewing one of these gobstoppers here, you'd break your teeth off. But they taste terrific, and they change color once a week, and they never get any smaller. They never disappear. Never! At least I don't think they do. There's one of them being tested this very moment in the testing room next door. An Oompa Loompa is sucking it. He's been sucking it for very nearly a year now without stopping, and it's still just as good as ever. Now over here," Mr. Wonka went on, skipping excitedly across the room to the opposite wall. "Over here, I am inventing a completely new line in toffees." He stopped beside a large saucepan. The saucepan was full of thick, gooey, purplish treacle, boiling and bubbling. By standing on his toes, little Charlie could just see inside it. "That's hair toffee!" cried Mr. Wonka. "You eat just one tiny bit of that, and in exactly half an hour, brand new, luscious, thick, silky, beautiful crop of hair will start growing out all over the top of your head. And a mustache! And a beard!"
"A beard?"
cried Veruca Salt.
"Who wants a beard, for heaven's sake?"
"It would suit you very well," said Mr. Wonka, "but unfortunately the mixture is not quite right yet. I've got it too strong. It works too well. I've tried it on an Oompa Loompa yesterday in the testing room, and immediately a huge beard started shooting out of his chin. And the beard grew so fast that soon it was trailing all over the floor in a thick, hairy carpet. It was growing faster than we could cut it. In the end, we had to use a lawnmower to keep it in check. But I'll get the mixture right soon, and when I do, there'll be no excuse anymore for little boys and girls going about with bald heads."
"But Mr. Wonka,"
said Mike Teavee, "little boys and girls never do go about with—" "Don't argue, my dear child, please don't argue," cried Mr. Wonka. "It's such a waste of precious time. Now over here, if you will all step this way, I will show you something that I'm terrifically proud of. Oh, do be careful. Don't knock anything over. Stand back." The Great Gum Machine. Mr. Wonka led the party over to a gigantic machine that stood in the very center of the inventing room. It was a mountain of gleaming metal that towered high above the children and their parents. Out of the very top of it, there sprouted hundreds and hundreds of thin glass tubes, and the glass tubes all curled downwards and came together in a bunch and hung suspended over an enormous round tub as big as a bath. "Here we go!" cried Mr. Wonka, and he pressed 3 different buttons on the side of the machine. A second later, a mighty rumbling sound came from inside it, and the whole machine began to shake most frighteningly, and steam began hissing out of it all over. And then suddenly, the watchers noticed that the runny stuff was pouring down the insides of all the hundreds of little glass tubes and squirting out into the great tub below. And in every single tube, the runny stuff was of a different color, so that all the colors of the rainbow, and many others as well, came sloshing and splashing into the tub. It was a lovely sight, and when the tub was nearly full, Mr. Wonka pressed another button, and immediately the running stuff stopped running out of the tubes. The rumbling sound disappeared, and a whizzing, whirring noise took its place. And then a giant whizzer started whizzing round inside the enormous tub, mixing up all the different colored liquids like an ice cream soda. Gradually, the mixture began to froth. It became frothier and frothier, and it turned from blue to white to green to yellow to yellow. Wait, what? And it turned from blue to white to green to brown to yellow, then back to blue again. "What?" said Mr. Wonka. Click went the machine, and the whizzers stopped whizzing, and now there came a sort of sucking noise, and very quickly all the blue frothy mixture in the huge basin was sucked back into the stomach of the machine. There was a moment of silence. Then a few queer rumblings were heard. Then silence again. Then suddenly, the machine let out a monstrous, mighty groan, and at the same moment, a tiny drawer, no bigger than the drawer in a slot machine, popped out the side of the machine. And in the drawer, there lay something so small and thin and gray that everyone thought it must be a mistake. The thing looked like a little strip of gray cardboard. The children and their parents stared at the little gray strip lying in the drawer. "You mean that's all?" said Mike Teavee, disgusted. "That's all," answered Mr. Wonka, gazing proudly at the result. "Don't you know what it is?" There's a pause. Then suddenly, Violet Beauregarde, the goofy gum-chewing girl, let out a yell of excitement. By gum, it's gum! She shrieked. It's a stick of chewing gum! Right you are, cried Mr. Wonka, slapping Violet hard on the back. It's a stick of gum. It's a stick of the most amazing and fabulous and sensational gum in the world. Hi, Mom. Goodbye, Violet. This gum, Mr. Wonka went on, is my latest, my greatest, my most fascinating invention. It's a chewing gum meal. It's that tiny little strip of gum lying there is a whole 3-course dinner all by itself. What sort of nonsense is this? Said one of the fathers. My dear sir, cried Mr. Wonka. When I start selling this gum in the shops, it will change everything. It will be the end of all kitchens and all cooking. There will be no more marketing to do. No more buying of meat and groceries. There'll be no knives and forks at mealtimes, no plates, no washing up, no garbage, no mess. Just a little strip of Wonka's magic chewing gum, and that's all you'll ever need at breakfast, lunch, and supper. This piece of gum I've just made happens to be tomato soup, roast beef, and blueberry pie, but you can have almost anything you want. You need this gum. 이랬대? 지훈아, 껌 갖다 줘. Gum. Take it, eat. And you're like,
알았어, 빨리.
김치찌개, whatever.
진짜 그럼 너무 좋을 것 같아.
What do you mean it's tomato soup, roast beef, and blueberry pie? Said Violet Beauregarde. If you were to start chewing it, said Mr. Wonka, then that is exactly what you would get on the menu. It's absolutely amazing. You can actually feel the food going down your throat and into your tummy. And you can taste it perfectly. And it fills you up. It satisfies you. It's terrific. It's utterly impossible, said Veruca Salt. Just so long as it's gum, shouted Violet Beauregarde. Just so long as it's a piece of gum and I can chew it, then that's for me. And quickly, she took her own world record piece of chewing gum out of her mouth and stuck it behind her left ear. Come on, Mr. Wonka, she said. Hand over this magic gum of yours and we'll see if the thing works. Now, Violet, said Mrs. Beauregarde, her mother, don't let's do anything silly, Violet. I want the gum, Violet said obstinately. What's so silly? I would rather you didn't take it, Mr. Wonka told her gently. You see, I haven't got it quite right yet. There are still 1 or 2 things. Oh, to heck with that, said Violet. And suddenly, before Mr. Wonka could stop her, she shot out a fat hand and grabbed the stick of gum out of the little drawer and popped it into her mouth. At once, her huge, well-trained jaws started chewing away on it like a pair of tongs. Don't! Said Mr. Wonka. Fabulous! Shouted Violet. It's tomato soup! It's hot and creamy and delicious! I can feel it running down my throat! Stop! Said Mr. Wonka. The gum isn't ready yet. It's not right. Of course it's right, said Violet. It's working beautifully. Oh my, what lovely soup this is! Spit it out, said Mr. Wonka. It's changing, shouted Violet, chewing and grinning both at the same time. The second course is coming up. It's roast beef. It's tender and juicy. Oh boy, what a flavor! The baked potato is marvelous too. It's got a crispy skin, and it's all filled with butter inside.
Roast beef with baked potato. crispy skin and butter.
But how interesting, Violet, said Mrs. Beauregard. You are a clever girl. Keep chewing, kiddo, said Mr. Beauregard. Keep right on chewing, baby. This is a great day for the Beauregards. Our little girl is the first person in the world to have a chewing gum meal.
Chewing, kiddo. My little girl's going to be the first person in the world to have a chewing gum meal.
Everybody was watching Violet Beauregard as she stood there chewing this extraordinary gum. Little Charlie Bucket was staring at her absolutely spellbound, watching her huge, rubbery lips as they pressed and unpressed with the chewing, and Grandpa Joe stood beside him, gaping at the girl. Mr. Wonka was wringing his hands and saying, No, 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 no! It isn't ready for eating! It isn't right! You mustn't do it! Blueberry pie and cream! Shouted Violet. Here it comes!
Blueberry pie and ice cream.
That part.
Oh my, it's perfect! It's beautiful! It's exactly as though I'm swallowing it! It's as though I'm chewing and swallowing great big spoonfuls of the most marvelous blueberry pie in the world! Good heavens, girl! Shrieked Mrs. Beauregard suddenly, staring at Violet. What's happening to your nose? Oh, be quiet, Mother, and let me finish, said Violet.
What's happening to her nose?
It's turning blue! Screamed Mrs. Beauregard. Your nose is turning blue as a blueberry! Your mother is right, shouted Mr. Beauregard. Your whole nose has gone purple. What do you mean? Said Violet, still chewing away. Your cheeks! Screamed Mrs. Beauregard. They're turning blue as well. So is your chin. Your whole face is turning blue. Spit that gum out at once, ordered Mr. Beauregard. Mercy, save us, yelled Mrs. Beauregard. The girl's going blue and purple all over. Even her hair's changing color. Violet, you're turning violet. Violet, what is happening to you?
What's happening?
I told you I hadn't got it quite right, sighed Mr. Wonka, shaking his head sadly. I'll say you haven't, cried Mrs. Beauregard. Just look at the girl now! Everybody was staring at Violet, and what a terrible, peculiar sight she was. Her face and hands and legs and neck, in fact, the skin all over her body, as well as her great big mop of curly hair, had turned a brilliant purplish blue, the color of blueberry juice. It always goes wrong when we come to the dessert, sighed Mr. Wonka. It's the blueberry pie that does it, but I'll get it right one day, you wait and see. Violet, screamed Mrs. Beauregard, you're swelling up. I feel sick, Violet said. You're swelling up, screamed Mrs. Beauregard again. I feel most peculiar, gasped Violet. I'm not surprised, said Mr. Beauregard. Great heavens, girl, screeched Mrs. Beauregard. You're blowing up like a balloon. Like a blueberry, said Mr. Wonka. Call a doctor, shouted Mr. Beauregard. Prick her with a pin, said one of the other fathers. Save her, cried Mrs. Beauregard, wringing her hands. But there was no saving her now. Her body was swelling up and changing shape at such a rate that within a minute it had turned into nothing less than an enormous, round, blue ball. A gigantic blueberry, in fact. And all that remained of Violet herself was a tiny pair of legs and a tiny pair of arms sticking out the great round fruit and a little head on top. It always happens like that, sighed Mr. Wonka. I've tried it 20 times in the testing room on 20 Oompa Loompas, and every one of them finished up as a blueberry. It's most annoying. I just can't understand it.
I've tried it on like 20 Oompa Loompas, and each one ended up as a blueberry. It's just weird.
But I don't want a blueberry for Donna, yelled Mrs. Beauregard. Put her back to what she was, this instant. Mr. Wonka clicked his fingers, and 10 Oompa Loompas appeared immediately at his side. Roll Miss Beauregard into the boat, he said to them, and take her along to the juicing room at once. The juicing room? Cried Mrs. Beauregard. What are they going to do with her there? Squeeze her, said Mr. Wonka. We've got to squeeze the juice out of her immediately. After that, we'll just have to see how she comes out. But don't worry, my dear Miss Beauregard. We'll get her repaired if it's the last thing we do. I am sorry about it all. I really am. Already, the 10 Oompa Loompas were rolling the enormous blueberry across the floor of the inventing room toward the door that led to the chocolate river where the boat was awaiting. Mr. and Mrs. Beauregard hurried after them. The rest of the party, including little Charlie Bucket and Grandpa Joe, stood absolutely still and watched them go. Listen, whispered Charlie. Listen, Grandpa. The Oompa Loompas in the boat outside are starting to sing. The voices, 100 of them singing together, came loud and clear into the room.
Dear friends, we surely all agree there's almost nothing worse to see than there's some repulsive little bum who's always chewing chewing gum. It's very near as bad as those who sit around and pick the nose, so please believe us when we say that chewing gum will never pay. This sticky habit's bound to send the chewer to a sticky end. Did any of you ever know a person called Miss Billigo? This dreadful woman saw no wrong in chewing all day long. She chewed while bathing in the tub. She chewed while dancing at her club. She chewed in church and on the bus. It really was quite ludicrous. And when she couldn't find her gum, she'd chew up the linoleum, or anything that happened near, a pair of boots, the postman's ear, or other people's underclothes, and once she chewed her boyfriend's nose. She went on chewing till at last her chewing muscles grew so vast that from her face her giant chin stuck out just like a violin. For years and years she chewed away, consuming 50 packs a day, until one summer's eve, alas, a horrid business came to pass. Miss Bigelow went late to bed. For half an hour she lay and read, chewing and chewing all the while, like some great clockwork crocodile. At last she put her gum away upon a special little tray, and settled back and went to sleep. But now, how strange! Although she slept, those massive jaws of hers still kept on chewing through the night, even with nothing there to bite. They were, you see, in such a groove they possibly had to move. And very grim it was to hear in pitch darkness, loud and clear, this sleeping woman's great big trap, opening and shutting, snap, 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 faster and faster, chop, chop, chop. The noise went on, it wouldn't stop, until at last her jaws decide to pause and open extra wide, and with the most tremendous chew, they bit the lady's tongue in two. Thereafter, just from chewing gum, Miss Bigelow was always dumb, and spent her life shut up in some disgusting sanatorium. And that is why we'll try so hard to save Miss Violet Beauregard from suffering an equal fate. She's still quite young, it's not too late. Provided she survives the cure, we hope she does, we can't be sure.
Along the corridor. Well, sighed Mr. Willy Wonka. 2 naughty children gone, 3 good children left. I think we'd better get out of this room quickly before we lose anyone else. But Mr. Wonka, said Charlie Bucket anxiously, will Violet Beauregard ever be all right again, or will she always be a blueberry? They'll de-juice her in no time flat, declared Mr. Wonka. They'll roll her into the de-juicing machine, and she'll come out just as thin as a whistle. But will she still be blue all over? Asked Charlie. She'll be purple, cried Mr. Wonka. A fine, rich purple from head to toe. But there you are. That's what comes from chewing disgusting gum all day long. If you think gum is so disgusting, said Mike TV, then why do you make it in your factory? I do wish you wouldn't mumble, said Mr. Wonka. I can't hear a word you're saying. Come on, off we go. Hurry up, follow me. We're going into the corridors again. And so saying, Mr. Wonka scuttled across to the far end of the inventing room and went out through a small secret door hidden behind a lot of pipes and stoves. The 3 remaining children, Veruca Salt, Mike TV, and Charlie Bucket, together with the 5 remaining grown-ups, followed after him. Charlie Bucket saw that they were now back in one of those long pink corridors with many other pink corridors leading out of it. Mr. Wonka was rushing along in front, turning left and right and right and left, and Grandpa Joe was saying, "Keep a good hold of my hand, Charlie. It would be terrible to get lost in here." Mr. Wonka was saying, "No time for any more messing about. We'll never get anywhere at the rate we've been going." And on he rushed down the endless pink corridors with his black top hat perched on the top of his head and his plum-colored velvet coattails flying out behind him like a flag in the wind. They passed another door, then another. There were doors every 20 paces or so along the corridor now, and they all had something written on them, and strange clanking noises were coming from behind several of them, and delicious smells came wafting through the keyholes, and sometimes little jets of colored steam shot out from the cracks underneath. Grandpa Joe and Charlie were half running and half walking to keep up with Mr. Wonka, but they were able to read what it said on quite a few of the doors as they hurried by. Eatable marshmallow pillows, it said on one. "Marshmallow pillows are terrific!" shouted Mr. Wonka as he dashed by. "They'll be all the rage when I get them into the shops. No time to go in, though. No time to go in." "Lickable wallpaper for nurseries," it said on the next door. "Lovely stuff! Lickable wallpaper!" cried Mr. Wonka, rushing past. "It has pictures of fruits on it. Bananas, apples, oranges, grapes, pineapples, strawberries, and snozberries." "Snozberries," said Mike TV. "Don't interrupt," said Mr. Wonka. "The wallpaper has pictures of all these fruits printed on it, and when you lick the picture of a banana, it tastes of a banana. When you lick a strawberry, it tastes of a strawberry. And when you lick a snozberry, it tastes just exactly like a snozberry." "But what does a snozberry taste like?" "You're mumbling again," said Mr. Wonka. "Speak louder next time. On we go. Hurry up." "Hot ice creams for cold days," it said on the next door. "Extremely useful in the winter," said Mr. Wonka, rushing on. "Hot ice cream warms you up no end in freezing weather. I also make hot ice cubes for putting in hot drinks. Hot ice cubes made hot drinks hotter." "Cows that give chocolate milk," it said on the next door. "Ah, my pretty little cows," cried Mr. Wonka. "How I love those cows." "Well, why can't we see them?" asked Veruca Salt. "Why do we have to go rushing on past all these lovely rooms?" "We shall stop in time," called out Mr. Wonka. "Don't be so madly impatient." "Fizzy lifting drinks," it said on the next door. "Oh, those are fabulous," cried Mr. Wonka. "They fill you with bubbles, and the bubbles are full of a special kind of gas, and this gas is so terrifically lifting that it lifts you right off the ground just like a balloon. And up you go until your head hits the ceiling, and there you stay."
재밌겠다.
Uh-huh. But how do you come down again? Asked little Charlie. You do a burp, of course, said Mr. Wonka. You do a great, big, long, rude burp, and up comes the gas, and down comes you. But don't drink it outdoors. There's no knowing how high up you'll be carried if you do that. I gave some to an old Oompa Loompa once out in the backyard, and he went up and up and up and disappeared out of sight. It was very sad. I never saw him again.
다시 해봐. 내가 웃었어.
I never saw him again. He should have burped, Charlie said. Of course he should have burped, said Mr. Wonka. I stood there shouting, Burp, you silly Oompa Loompa! Burp, or you'll never come down again! But he didn't, or couldn't, or wouldn't. I don't know which. Maybe he was too polite. He must be on the moon by now. Didn't is 안 한 거야.
Uh-huh.
Wouldn't is would not. 할 수 있는데 안 한 거야.
Uh-huh. did는 안 했고, couldn't는 할 수 없었고,
wouldn't?
응.
할 수 있어도 안 한다고. On the next door, it said, Square candies that look round. Wait! Cried Mr. Wonka, skidding suddenly to a halt. I am very proud of my square candies that look round. Let's take a peek. Square candies that look round. They look square, but Mama, they look around. Everybody stopped and crowded to the door. The top half of the door was made of glass. Grandpa Joe lifted Charlie up so he could get a better view. And looking in, Charlie saw a long table, and on the table there were rows and rows of small, white, square-shaped candies. The candies looked very much like square sugar lumps, except that each of them had a funny little pink face painted on one side. At the end of the table, a number of Oompa Loompas were busily painting more faces on more candies. There you are, cried Mr. Wonka. Square candies that look round. They don't look round to me, said Mike TV. They look square, said Veruca Salt. They look completely square. But they are square, said Mr. Wonka. I never said that they weren't. You said they were round, said Veruca Salt. I never said anything of the sort, said Mr. Wonka. I said they looked round. But they don't look round, said Veruca Salt. They look square. They look round, insisted Mr. Wonka. They most certainly do not look round, cried Veruca Salt. Veruca, darling, said Mrs. Salt, pay no attention to Mr. Wonka. He's lying to you. My dear old fish, said Mr. Wonka, go and boil your head. How dare you speak to me like that? Shouted Mrs. Salt. Oh, do shut up, said Mr. Wonka. Now watch this. He took a key from his pocket and unlocked the door and flung it open. And suddenly, at the sound of the door opening, all the rows and rows of little square candies looked quickly round to see who was coming in. The tiny faces actually turned toward the door and stared at Mr. Wonka. I would feel bad eating them.
근데 왜 이렇게 민하게 얘기했어, 이 미스터 원카가?
There you are, he cried triumphantly. They're looking round. There's no argument about it. They are square candies that look round. By golly, he's right, said Grandpa Joe. Come on, said Mr. Wonka, starting off down the corridor again. On we go. We mustn't dawdle. Butterscotch and butter gin, it said on the next door they passed. Now that sounds a bit more interesting, said Mr. Salt, Veruca's father. Glorious stuff, said Mr. Wonka. The Oompa Loompas all adore it. It makes them tiddly. Listen! You can hear them in there now, whooping it up. Shrieks of laughter and snatches of singing could be heard coming through the closed door. "They're drunk as lords," said Mr. Wonka. "They're drinking butterscotch and soda. They like that best of all. Butter gin and tonic is also very popular. Follow me, please. We really mustn't keep stopping like this." He turned left. He turned right. They came to a long flight of stairs. Mr. Wonka slid down the banisters. The three children did the same. Mrs. Salt and Mrs. Teavee, the only woman now left in the party, were getting very out of breath. Mrs. Salt was a great fat creature with short legs, and she was blowing like a rhinoceros. "This way!" cried Mr. Wonka, turning left at the bottom of the stairs. "Go slower!" panted Mrs. Salt. "Impossible!" said Mr. Wonka. "We should never get there in time if I did." "Get where?" asked Veruca Salt. "Never you mind," said Mr. Wonka. "You just wait and see." Veruca in the nut room. Mr. Wonka rushed on down the corridor. The nut room, it said on the next door they came to. "All right," said Mr. Wonka. "Stop here for a moment and catch your breath and take a peek through the glass panel of this door. But don't go in. Whatever you do, don't go into the nut room. If you go in, you'll disturb the squirrels." Everyone crowded around the door. "Oh, look, Grandpa, look!" cried Charlie. "Squirrels!" shouted Veruca Salt. "Jeepers!" said Mike Teavee. It was an amazing sight. 100 squirrels were seated upon high stools around a large table. On the table, there were mounds and mounds of walnuts, and the squirrels were all working away like mad, shelling the walnuts at tremendous speed. "These squirrels are especially trained for getting the nuts out of walnuts," Mr. Wonka explained. "Why use squirrels?" Mike Teavee asked. "Why not use Oompa Loompas?" "Because," said Mr. Wonka, "Oompa Loompas can't get walnuts out of walnut shells in one piece. They always break them in two. Nobody except squirrels can get walnuts whole out of walnut shells every time. It is extremely difficult. But in my factory, I insist upon using only whole walnuts. Therefore, I have to have squirrels to do the job. Aren't they wonderful, the way they get those nuts out? And see how they first tap each walnut with their knuckles to be sure it's not a bad one. If it's bad, it makes a hollow sound, and they don't bother to open it. They just throw it down the garbage chute. There, look! Watch that squirrel nearest to us. I think he's got a bad one now." They watched the little squirrel as he tapped the walnut shell with his knuckles. He cocked his head to one side, listening intently, then suddenly threw the nut over his shoulder into a large hole in the floor. "Hey, Mummy!" shouted Veruca Salt suddenly. "I've decided I want a squirrel. Get me one of their squirrels." "Don't be silly, sweetheart," said Mrs. Salt. "These all belong to Mr. Wonka." "I don't care about that," shouted Veruca. "I want one. All I've got at home is 2 dogs and 4 cats and 6 bunny rabbits and 2 parakeets and 3 canaries and a green parrot and a turtle and a bowl of goldfish and a cage of white mice and a silly old hamster. I want a squirrel." Gee, she has a lot of things. How does she even take care of them? "All right, my pet," Mrs. Salt said soothingly. "Mummy will get you a squirrel just as soon as she possibly can." "But I don't want any old squirrel," Veruca shouted. "I want a trained squirrel." At this point, Mr. Salt, Veruca's father, stepped forward. Very well, Wonka, he said importantly, taking out a wallet full of money. How much did you want for one of these crazy squirrels? Name your price. They're not for sale, Mr. Wonka answered. She can't have one. Who says I can't? Shouted Veruca. I'm going in to grab me a squirrel this very minute. Don't, said Mr. Wonka quickly, but he was too late. The girl had already thrown open the door and rushed in. The moment she entered the room, 100 squirrels stopped what they were doing and turned their heads and stared at her with small black beady eyes. Veruca Salt stopped also and stared back at them. Then her gaze fell upon a pretty little squirrel sitting nearest to her at the end of the table. The squirrel was holding a walnut in its paws. All right, Veruca said. I'll have you. She reached out her hands to grab the squirrel, but as she did so, in that first split second when her hands started to go forward, there was a sudden flash of movement in the room, like a flash of brown lightning, and every single squirrel around the table took a flying leap towards her and landed on her body. 25 of them caught hold of her right arm and pinned it down. 25 more caught hold of her left arm and pinned that down. 25 caught hold of her right leg and anchored it to the ground. 24 caught hold of her left leg. And the one remaining squirrel, obviously the leader of them all, climbed up onto her shoulder and started tapping the wretched girl's head with its knuckles. Save her! Screamed Mrs. Salt. Veruca, come back! What are they doing to her? They're testing her to see if she's a bad nut, said Mr. Wonka. You watch. Veruca struggled furiously, but the squirrels held her tight and she couldn't move. The squirrel on her shoulder went tapping the side of her head with his knuckles. Then all at once, the squirrels pulled Veruca to the ground and started carrying her across the floor. My goodness, she is a bad nut after all, said Mr. Wonka. Her head must have sounded quite hollow. Veruca kicked and screamed, but it was no use. The tiny, strong paws held her tightly, and she couldn't escape. Where are they taking her? Shrieked Mrs. Salt. She's going where all the other bad nuts go, said Mr. Willy Wonka. Down the garbage chute. By golly, she is going down the chute, said Mr. Salt, staring through the glass door at his daughter. Then save her! Cried Mrs. Salt. Too late, said Mr. Wonka. She's gone. And indeed she had. But where? Shrieked Mrs. Salt, flapping her arms. What happens to the bad nuts? Where does the chute go to? That particular chute, Mr. Wonka told her, runs directly into the great big main garbage pipe, which carries away all the rubbish from every part of the factory. All the floor sweepings, and potato peelings, and rotten cabbages, and fish heads, and stuff like that. Who eats fish and cabbage and potatoes in this factory, I'd like to know, said Mike TV. I do, of course, answered Mr. Wonka. You don't think I live on cacao beans, do you? But, shrieked Mrs. Salt. Where does the great big pipe go to in the end? Why, to the furnace, of course, Mr. Wonka said calmly. To the incinerator. Burn things. Tear things so it's easier to discard them. Mrs. Salt opened her huge red mouth and started to scream. Don't worry, said Mr. Wonka. There's always a chance that they've decided not to light it today. A chance? Yelled Mrs. Salt. My darling Veruca, She'll be sizzled like a sausage. Quite right, my dear, said Mr. Salt. Now see here, Wonka, he added. I think you've gone just a shade too far this time, I do indeed. My daughter may be a bit of a frump, I don't mind admitting it, but that doesn't mean you can roast her to a crisp. I'll have you know I'm extremely cross about this. I really am. Oh, don't be cross, my dear sir, said Mr. Wonka. I expect she'll turn up again sooner or later. She may not even have gone down at all. She may be stuck in the chute just below the entrance hole.
Now, she may be stuck in the chute just below the top. If that's the case...
And if that's the case, all you have to do is go in and pull her up again.
All you have to do is just reach in and pull her out.
Hearing this, both Mr. and Mrs. Salt dashed into the nut room and ran over to the hole in the floor and peered in. Veruca, shouted Mrs. Salt, are you down there? There was no answer. Mrs. Salt bent further forward to get a closer look. She was now kneeling right on the edge of the hole with her head down and her enormous behind sticking up in the air like a giant mushroom. It was a dangerous position to be in. She needed only one tiny little push, one gentle nudge in the right place, and that is exactly what the squirrels gave her. Over she toppled, into the hole head first, screeching like a parrot. Good gracious me, said Mr. Salt, as he watched his fat wife go tumbling down the hole. What a load of garbage there is going to be today. He saw her disappearing into darkness. What's it like down there, Aunt Gina? He called out. He leaned further forward. I know, they're smarter than her.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, we better throw this guy down the chute. The squirrels rushed up behind him. Help! He shouted, but he was already toppling forward, and down the chute he went, just as his wife had done before him, and his daughter. Oh dear, cried Charlie, who was watching with the others through the door. What on earth's going to happen to them now? I expect someone will catch them at the bottom of the chute, said Mr. Wonka. But what about the great fiery incinerator? Asked Charlie. They only light it every other day, said Mr. Wonka. Perhaps this is one of the days when they let it go out. You never know. They might be lucky. Shh, said Grandpa Joe. Listen. Here comes another song. From far away down the corridor came the beating of drums. Then the singing began.
Veruca Salt,
sang the Oompa Loompas. Veruca Salt, the little brute, has just gone down the garbage chute. And as we very rightly thought that in a case like this we ought to see the thing completely through, we've polished off her parents too. Down goes Veruca, down the drain, and here perhaps we should explain that she will meet as she descends a rather different set of friends. To those that she has left behind, these won't be nearly so refined. A fish head, for example, cut this morning from a halibut. Hello, good morning, how do you do? How nice to meet you, how are you? And then a little further down, a mass of others gather round. A bacon rind, some rancid lard, a loaf of bread gone stale and hard, a steak that nobody could chew, an oyster from an oyster stew, some liverwurst so old and gray, one smelled it from a mile away, a rotten nut, a reeky pear, a thing the cat left on the stair, and lots of other things as well, each with a rather horrid smell. These are Veruca's newfound friends that she will meet as she descends, and this is the price she has to pay for going so very far astray. But now, my dears, we think you might be wondering, is it really right that every single bit of blame and all the scolding and the shame should fall upon Veruca Salt? Is she the only one at fault? For though she's spoiled and dreadfully so, a girl can't spoil herself, you know. Who spoiled her then? Ah, who indeed? Who pandered to her every need? Who turned her into such a brat? Who are the culprits? Who did that? Alas, you needn't look so far to find out who these sinners are. They are, and this is very sad, her loving parents, Mom and Dad. And that is why we're glad they fell into the garbage chute as well. This song, they truly mean everything that they said.
맞아.
Oh my god, the Oompa Loompas are toxic. The Great Glass Elevator. I've never seen anything like it, cried Mr. Wonka. The children are disappearing like rabbits. But you mustn't worry about it. They'll all come out in the wash. Mr. Wonka looked at the little group that stood beside him in the corridor. There were only 2 children left now, Mike TV and Charlie Bucket. And there were 3 grown-ups, Mr. and Mrs. TV and Grandpa Joe. Shall we move on? Mr. Wonka asked. Oh, yes, cried Charlie and Grandpa Joe, both together. My feet are getting tired, said Mike TV. I want to watch television. If you're tired, then we'd better take the elevator, said Mr. Wonka. It's over here. Come on, in we go. He skipped across the passage to a pair of double doors. The doors slid open. The 2 children and the grown-ups went in. Now then, cried Mr. Wonka, which button shall we press first? Take your pick. Charlie Bucket stared around him in astonishment. This was the craziest elevator he had ever seen. There were buttons everywhere. The walls, and even the ceiling, were covered all over with rows and rows and rows of small black push buttons. There must have been 1,000 of them on each wall, and another 1,000 on the ceiling. And now, Charlie noticed that every single button had a tiny printed label beside it, telling you which room you would be taken to if you pressed it. This isn't just an ordinary up-and-down elevator, announced Mr. Wonka proudly. This elevator can go sideways and long ways and slantways and any other way you can think of. It can visit any single room in the whole factory, no matter where it is. You simply press the button and zing! You're off. Fantastic, murmured Grandpa Joe. His eyes were shining with excitement as he stared at the rows and rows of buttons. The whole elevator is made of thick, clear glass, Mr. Wonka declared. Walls, doors, ceiling, floor, everything is made of glass so that you can see out. But there's nothing to see, said Mike TV. Choose a button, said Mr. Wonka. The 2 children may press 1 button each. So take your pick. Hurry up. In every room, something delicious and wonderful is being made. Quickly, Charlie started reading some of the labels alongside the buttons. The Rock Candy Mine. 10,000 feet deep, it said on one. Coconut ice skating rinks, it said on another. Then, strawberry juice water pistols. Toffee apple trees for planting out in your garden. All sizes. Exploding candy for your enemies. Luminous lollies for eating in bed at night. Mint jujubes for the boy next door. They'll give him green teeth for a month. Cavity-filling caramels. No more dentists. Stickjaw for talkative parents. Wriggle sweets that wriggle delightfully in your tummy after swallowing. Invisible chocolate bars for eating in class. Candy-coated pencils for sucking. Fizzy lemonade swimming pools. Magic hand fudge. When you hold it in your hand, you taste it in your mouth. Rainbow drops. Suck them and you can spit in 6 different colors. Come on, cried Mr. Wonka. We can't wait all day. Isn't there a television room in all this lot? Asked Mike TV. Certainly there's a television room, Mr. Wonka said. That button over there. He pointed with his finger. Everybody looked. Television chocolate. It said on the tiny label beside the button. Whoopee! Shouted Mike TV. That's for me! He stuck out his thumb and pressed the button. Instantly, there was a tremendous whizzing noise. The doors clanged shut, and the elevator leaped away as though it had been stung by a wasp. But it leapt sideways, and all the passengers, except Mr. Wonka, who was holding on to a strap from the ceiling, were flung off their feet onto the floor. Get up! Get up! Cried Mr. Wonka, roaring with laughter. But just as they were staggering to their feet, the elevator changed directions and swerved violently round a corner. And over they went once more. Help! Shouted Mrs. TV. Take my hand, madam, said Mr. Wonka gallantly. There you are. Now grab this strap. Everybody grab a strap. The journey's not over yet. Old Grandpa Joe staggered to his feet and caught hold of a strap. Little Charlie, who couldn't possibly reach as high as that, put his arms around Grandpa Joe's legs and hung on tight. The elevator rushed on at the speed of a rocket. Now it was beginning to climb. It was shooting up and up and up on a steep, slanty course, as if it were climbing a very steep hill. Then suddenly, as though it had come to the top of the hill and gone over a precipice, it dropped like a stone, and Charlie felt his tummy coming right up into his throat. And Grandpa Joe shouted, Yippee! Here we go! And Mrs. TV cried out, The rope has broken! We're going to crash! And Mr. Wonka said, Calm yourself, my dear lady, and patted her comfortingly on the arm. And then Grandpa Joe looked down at Charlie, who was clinging to his legs, and he said, Are you all right, Charlie? Charlie shouted, I love it! It's like being on a roller coaster! And through the glass walls of the elevator, as it rushed along, they caught sudden glimpses of strange and wonderful things going on in some of the other rooms. An enormous spout with brown sticky stuff oozing out of it onto the floor. A great craggy mountain made entirely of fudge, with Oompa Loompas, all roped together for safety, hacking huge hunks of fudge out of its sides. A machine with white powder sprang out of it like a snowstorm. A lake of hot caramel with steam coming off it. A village of Oompa Loompas with tiny houses and streets and hundreds of Oompa Loompa children, no more than 4 inches high, playing in the streets. And now the elevator began flattening out again, but it seemed to be going faster than ever. And Charlie could hear the scream of the wind outside as it hurtled forward, and it twisted, and it turned, and it went up, and it went down, and, I'm going to be sick! Yelled Mrs. TV, turning green in the face. Please don't be sick, said Mr. Wonka. Try and stop me, said Mrs. TV. Then you'd better take this, said Mr. Wonka, and he swept his magnificent black top hat off his head and held it out upside down in front of Mrs. TV's mouth. Make this awful thing stop, ordered Mr. TV. Can't do that, said Mr. Wonka. It won't stop till we get there. I only hope no one's using the other elevator at this moment. What other elevator? screamed Mrs. TV. "The one that goes the opposite way on the same track as this one," said Mr. Wonka. "Holy mackerel!" cried Mr. TV. "You mean we might have a collision?" "I've always been lucky so far," said Mr. Wonka. "Now I am going to be sick," yelled Mrs. TV. "No, no," said Mr. Wonka. "Not now. We're nearly there. Don't spoil my hat." The next moment, there was a screaming of brakes, and the elevator began to slow down. Then it stopped altogether. "Some ride," said Mr. TV, wiping his great sweaty face with a handkerchief. "Never again," gasped Mrs. TV. And then the doors of the elevator slid open, and Mr. Wonka said, "Just a minute now. Listen to me. I want everybody to be very careful in this room. There is dangerous stuff around in here, and you must not tamper with it." The television chocolate room. The TV family, together with Charlie and Grandpa Joe, stepped out of the elevator into a room so dazzlingly bright and dazzlingly white that they screwed up their eyes in pain and stopped walking. Mr. Wonka handed each of them a pair of dark glasses and said, "Put these on quick, and don't take them off in here whatever you do. This light could blind you." As soon as Charlie had his dark glasses on, he was able to look around him in comfort. He saw a long, narrow room. The room was painted white all over. Even the floor was white, and there wasn't a speck of dust anywhere. The room was completely bare except at the far ends. At one of these ends, there was an enormous camera on wheels, and a whole army of Oompa Loompas was clustering around it, oiling its joints and adjusting its knobs and polishing its great glass lens. The Oompa Loompas were all dressed in the most extraordinary way. They were wearing bright red spacesuits, complete with helmets and goggles. At least, they looked like spacesuits, and they were working in complete silence. Watching them, Charlie experienced a queer sense of danger. There was something dangerous about this whole business, and the Oompa Loompas knew it. There was no chattering or singing among them here, and they moved about over the huge black camera, slowly and carefully in their scarlet spacesuits. At the other end of the room, about 50 paces away from the camera, a single Oompa Loompa, also wearing a spacesuit, was sitting at a black table, gazing at the screen of a very large television set. "Here we go!" cried Mr. Wonka, hopping up and down with excitement. "This is the testing room for my very latest and greatest invention, television chocolate." "But what is television chocolate?" asked Mike TV. "Good heavens, child, stop interrupting me!" said Mr. Wonka. "It works by television. I don't like television myself. I suppose it's all right in small doses, but children never seem to be able to take it in small doses. They want to sit there all day long, staring and staring at the screen." "That's me," said Mike TV. "Shut up," said Mr. TV. "Thank you," said Mr. Wonka. "I shall now tell you how this amazing television set of mine works. But first of all, do you know how ordinary television works? It is very simple. At one end, where the picture is being taken, you have a large movie camera and you start photographing something. The photographs are then split up into millions of tiny little pieces, which are so small that you can't see them, and these pieces are shot out into the sky by electricity. In the sky, they go whizzing around all over the place until suddenly they hit the antenna on the roof of somebody's house. They then go flashing down the wire that leads right into the back of the television set, and in there they get jiggled and joggled around until every single one of those millions of tiny pieces is fitted back into its right place. Just like a jigsaw puzzle, and presto, the photograph appears on the screen. That isn't exactly how it works, Mike TV said. I am a little deaf in my left ear, Mr. Wonka said. You must forgive me if I don't hear everything you say. I said that isn't exactly how it works, shouted Mike TV. You're a nice boy, Mr. Wonka said, but you talk too much. Now then, the very first time I saw ordinary television working, I was struck by a tremendous idea. Look here, I shouted. If these people can break up a photograph into millions of pieces and send the pieces whizzing through the air and then put them together again at the other end, why can't I do the same thing with a bar of chocolate? Why can't I send a real bar of chocolate whizzing through the air in tiny pieces and then put the pieces together at the other end, all ready to be eaten? Impossible, said Mike TV. You think so? Cried Mr. Wonka. Well, watch this. I shall now send a bar of my very best chocolate from one end of this room to the other, by television. Get ready there. Bring the chocolate. Immediately, 6 Oompa Loompas marched forward carrying on their shoulders the most enormous bar of chocolate Charlie had ever seen. It was about the size of the mattress he slept on at home. It has to be big, Mr. Wonka explained, because whenever you send something by television, it always comes out much smaller than it was when it went in. Even with ordinary television, when you photograph a big man, he never comes out on your screen any taller than a pencil. Does he? Here we go then. Get ready. No, stop! Hold everything! You there, Mike TV, stand back! You're too close to the camera! There are dangerous rays coming out of that thing. They could break you up into 1 million tiny pieces in 1 second. That's why the Oompa Loompas are wearing spacesuits. The suits protect them. All right, that's better. Now then, switch on. One of the Oompa Loompas caught hold of a large switch and pulled it down. There was a blinding flash. The chocolate's gone, shouted Grandpa Joe, waving his arms. He was quite right. The whole enormous bar of chocolate had disappeared completely into thin air. It's on its way, cried Mr. Wonka. It is now rushing through the air above our heads in 1 million tiny pieces. Quick, come over here. He dashed over to the other end of the room where the large television set was standing, and the others followed him. Watch the screen, he cried. Here it comes. Look! The screen flickered and lit up. Then suddenly, a small bar of chocolate appeared in the middle of the screen. Take it! Shouted Mr. Wonka, growing more and more excited. How can you take it? Asked Mike TV, laughing. It's just a picture on the television screen. Charlie Bucket, cried Mr. Wonka. You take it. Reach out and grab it. Charlie put out his hand and touched the screen, and suddenly, miraculously, the bar of chocolate came away in his fingers. He was so surprised he nearly dropped it. Eat it, shouted Mr. Wonka. Go on and eat it. It'll be delicious. It's the same bar. It's gotten smaller on the journey, that's all. It's absolutely fantastic, gasped Grandpa Joe. It's a miracle. Just imagine, cried Mr. Wonka, when I start using this across the country, you'll be sitting at home watching television, and suddenly a commercial will flash onto the screen, and a voice will say, Eat Wonka's chocolates. They're the best in the world. If you don't believe us, try one for yourself. Now! and you simply reach out and take one. How about that, eh? Terrific! Cried Grandpa Joe. It will change the world. Aha! Hi, everyone. Mike TV is sent by television. Mike TV was even more excited than Grandpa Joe at seeing a bar of chocolate being sent by television. But Mr. Wonka, he shouted, can you send other things through the air in the same way? Breakfast cereal, for instance? Oh, my sainted aunt, cried Mr. Wonka. Don't mention that disgusting stuff in front of me. Do you know what breakfast cereal is made of? It's made of all those little curly wooden shavings you find in pencil sharpeners. But could you send it by television if you wanted to, as you do chocolate? Asked Mike TV. Of course I could. And what about people? Asked Mike TV. Could you send a real live person from one place to another in the same way? A person? Cried Mr. Wonka. Are you off your rocker? But could it be done? Good heavens, child. I really don't know. I suppose it could. Yes, I'm pretty sure it could. Of course it could. I wouldn't like to risk it, though. It might have some very nasty results. But Mike TV was already off and running. The moment he heard Mr. Wonka saying, I'm pretty sure it could. Of course it could. He turned away and started running as fast as he could towards the other end of the room where the great camera was standing. Look at me! He shouted as he ran. I'm going to be the first person in the world to be sent by television. No, 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 cried Mr. Wonka. Mike, screamed Mrs. TV. Stop! Come back! You'll be turned into a million tiny pieces! But there was no stopping Mike TV now. The crazy boy rushed on, and when he reached the enormous camera, he jumped straight for the switch, scattering Oompa Loompas right and left as he went. See you later, alligator! He shouted, and he pulled down the switch, and as he did so, he leaped out into the full glare of the mighty lens. There was a blinding flash. Then there was silence.
Bye-bye.
Then Mrs. TV ran forward, but she stopped dead in the middle of the room, and she stood there. She stood staring at the place where her son had been, and her great red mouth opened wide, and she screamed, He's gone! He's gone!
He's gone.
Let's go check the television, see what we get.
Great heavens, he has gone! Shouted Mr. TV. Mr. Wonka hurried forward and placed a hand gently on Mrs. TV's shoulder. We shall have to hope for the best, he said. We must pray that your little boy will come out unharmed at the other end. Mike! Screamed Mrs. TV, clasping her head in her hands. Where are you? I'll tell you where he is, said Mr. TV. He's whizzing around above our heads in a million tiny pieces. Don't talk about it, wailed Mrs. TV. We must watch the television set, said Mr. Wonka. He may come through any moment. Mr. and Mrs. TV and Grandpa Joe and little Charlie and Mr. Wonka all gathered round the television and stared tensely at the screen. The screen was quite blank. He's taking a heck of a long time to come across, said Mr. TV, wiping his brow. Oh dear, said Mr. Wonka. I do hope that no part of him gets left behind. What on earth do you mean? Asked Mr. TV sharply.
What do you mean?
I don't wish to alarm you, said Mr. Wonka, but it does sometimes happen that only about half the little pieces find their way into the television set.
Well, sometimes only half the little pieces find their way through.
It happened last week. I don't know why, but the result was that only half a bar of chocolate came through. Mrs. TV let out a scream of horror. You mean only half of Mike is coming back to us? She cried. Let's hope it's the top half, said Mr. TV. Hold everything, said Mr. Wonka. Watch the screen. Something's happening. The screen had suddenly begun to flicker. Then some wavy lines appeared. Mr. Wonka adjusted one of the knobs and the wavy lines went away. And now, very slowly, the screen began to get brighter and brighter. Here he comes, yelled Mr. Wonka. Yes, that's him all right. Is he all in one piece? Cried Mrs. TV. I'm not sure, said Mr. Wonka. It's too early to tell. Faintly at first, but becoming clearer and clearer every second, the picture of Mike TV appeared on the screen. He was standing up and waving at the audience and grinning from ear to ear. But he's a midget, shouted Mr. TV. Mike, cried Mrs. TV. Are you all right? Are there any bits of you missing? Is he going to get any bigger? Shouted Mr. TV. Talk to me, Mike, cried Mrs. TV. Say something. Tell me you're all right. A tiny little voice, no louder than the squeaking of a mouse, came out of the television set.
Hi, Mom,
it said.
Hi, Pop. Look at me. I'm the first person ever to be sent by television.
Grab him, ordered Mr. Wonka. Quick!
Somebody grab him.
Mrs. TV shot out a hand and picked the tiny figure of Mike TV out of the screen. Hooray! Cried Mr. Wonka. He's all in one piece. He's completely unharmed.
Oh, thank heavens, he's completely unharmed.
You call that unharmed? Snapped Mrs. TV, peering at the little speck of a boy who was now running to and fro across the palm of her hand, waving his pistols in the air.
Unharmed? What are you talking about?
He was certainly not more than an inch tall. He's shrunk, said Mr. TV. Of course he's shrunk, said Mr. Wonka. What did you expect? This is terrible, wailed Mrs. TV. What are we going to do? And Mr. TV said, We can't send him back to school like this. He'll get trod upon. He'll get squashed. He won't be able to do anything, cried Mrs. TV.
Oh, yes, I will,
squeaked the tiny voice of Mike TV.
I'll still be able to watch television.
Never again, shouted Mr. TV. I'm throwing the television set right out the window the moment we get home. I've had enough of television. When he heard this, Mike TV flew into a terrible tantrum. He started jumping up and down on the palm of his mother's hand, screaming and yelling and trying to bite her fingers.
I want to watch television,
he squeaked.
I want to watch television. I want to watch television. I want to watch television.
Here, give him to me, said Mr. TV, and he took the tiny boy and shoved him into the breast pocket of his jacket and stuffed a handkerchief on top. Squeals and yells came from inside the pocket, and the pocket shook as the furious little prisoner fought to get out.
Let me out! Get me out of here!
Oh, Mr. Wonka, wailed Mrs. TV. How can we make him grow? Well, said Mr. Wonka, stroking his beard and gazing thoughtfully at the ceiling. I must say that's a wee bit tricky, but small boys are extremely springy and elastic. They stretch like mad. So what we'll do, we'll put him in a special machine I have for testing the stretchiness of chewing gum. Maybe that will bring him back to what he was. Oh, thank you, said Mrs. TV. Don't mention it, dear lady. How far do you think he'll stretch? Asked Mr. TV. Maybe miles, said Mr. Wonka. Who knows? But he's going to be awfully thin. Everything gets thinner when you stretch it. You mean like chewing gum? Asked Mr. TV. Exactly. How thin will he be? Asked Mrs. TV anxiously. I haven't the foggiest idea, said Mr. Wonka. And it doesn't really matter anyway, because we'll soon fatten him up again. All we have to do is give him a triple overdose of my wonderful super vitamin candy. Super vitamin candy contains huge amounts of vitamin A and vitamin B. It also contains vitamin C, vitamin D,
vitamin E, vitamin F, vitamin G, vitamin I, vitamin J, vitamin K, vitamin L, vitamin M, vitamin N, vitamin O, vitamin P, vitamin Q, vitamin R, vitamin T, vitamin U, vitamin V, vitamin W, vitamin X,
vitamin Y, and, believe it or not, vitamin Z.
야, 알파벳을 다 하네.
No, 못 빠졌어. The only two vitamins it doesn't have in it are vitamin S, because it makes you sick, and vitamin H, because it makes you grow horns out the top of your head, like a bull. But it does have in it a very small amount of the rarest and most magical vitamin of them all, vitamin Wonka. And what will that do to him? Asked Mr. TV anxiously. It'll make his toes grow out until they're as long as his fingers. Oh, no! Cried Mrs. TV. Don't be silly, said Mr. Wonka. It's most useful. He'll be able to play the piano with his feet. But Mr. Wonka... No arguments, please, said Mr. Wonka. He turned away and clicked his fingers 3 times in the air. An Oompa Loompa appeared immediately and stood beside him. Follow these orders, said Mr. Wonka, handing the Oompa Loompa a piece of paper on which he had written full instructions. And you'll find the boy in his father's pocket. Off you go. Goodbye, Mr. TV. Goodbye, Mrs. TV. And please don't look so worried. They all come out in the wash, you know. Every one of them. Mom, I am so scared of Mr. Wonka by the fact that he is so not concerned about anything that has happened to any of the children so far. He talks about it as if it happens every day.
이거 소설이잖아.
Oh, they'll stretch him out until he becomes a
그래서
pancake.
그때 보니까 이렇게 띵하게 가는 애 걔지? 껌처럼 가는 애, 길쭉한 애.
At the end of the room, the Oompa Loompas around the giant camera were already beating their tiny drums and beginning to jog up and down to the rhythm. There they go again, said Mr. Wonka. I'm afraid you can't stop them singing. Little Charlie caught Grandpa Joe's hand, and the two of them stood beside Mr. Wonka in the middle of the long, bright room, listening to the Oompa Loompas. And this is what they sang. Every single time.
The most important thing we've learned, so far as children are concerned, is never, never, never let them near your television set. Or better still, just don't install the idiotic thing at all. In almost every house we've been, we've watched them gaping at the screen. They loll and slop and lounge about and stare until their eyes pop out. Last week in someone's place, we saw a dozen eyeballs on the floor. They sit and stare and stare and sit until they're hypnotized by it, until they're absolutely drunk with all that shocking, ghastly junk. Oh yes, we know it keeps them still. They don't climb out the window still. They never fight or kick or punch. They leave you free to cook the lunch and wash the dishes in the sink. But did you ever stop to think, to wonder just exactly what this does to your beloved tot? It rots the senses in the head. It kills imagination dead. It clogs and clutters up the mind. It makes a child so dull and blind. He can no longer understand a fantasy, a fairyland. Beans! His brain becomes as soft as cheese. His powers of thinking rust and freeze. He cannot think, he only sees. All right, you'll cry. All right, you'll say. But if we take the set away, what shall we do to entertain our darling children? Please explain. We'll answer this by asking you, what used the darling ones to do? How used they keep themselves contented before this monster was invented? Have you forgotten? Don't you know? We'll say it very loud and slow. They used to read. They'd read and read and read and read, and then proceed to read some more. Great Scott! Gadzooks! 1/2 of their lives was reading books. The nursery shelves held books galore. Books cluttered up the nursery floor. And in the bedroom, by the bed, more books were waiting to be read. Just how the camel got his hump, and how the monkey lost his rump, and Mr. Toad, and bless my soul, there's Mr. Rat and Mr. Mole. Oh, books, what books they used to know, those children living long ago. So please, oh please, we beg, we pray, go throw your TV set away, and in its place you can install a lovely bookshelf on the wall. Then fill the shelves with lots of books, ignoring all the dirty looks, the screams and yells, the bites and kicks, and children hitting you with sticks. Fear not, because we promise you that in about a week or two of having nothing else to do, they'll now begin to feel the need of having something good to read. And once they start, oh boy, you watch the slowly growing joy that fills their hearts. They'll grow so keen. They'll wonder what they'd ever seen in that ridiculous machine, that nauseating, foul, unclean, repulsive television screen. And later, each and every kid will love you more for what you did. P.S. Regarding Mike TV, we very much regret that we shall simply have to wait and see if we can get him back his height. But if we can't, it serves him right.
찰리밖에 안 나왔어. 28장.
Which room shall it be next? Said Mr. Wonka, as he turned away and darted into the elevator. Come on, hurry up, we must get going. And how many children are there left now?
How many children are left?
Little Charlie looked at Grandpa Joe, and Grandpa Joe looked back at Little Charlie. But Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe called after him, there's only Charlie left now.
Mr. Wonka, Charlie's the only one left now.
Mr. Wonka swung round and stared at Charlie. There was silence. Charlie stood there holding tightly onto Grandpa Joe's hand. You mean you're the only one left? Mr. Wonka said, pretending to be surprised. Why, yes, whispered Charlie. Yes. Mr. Wonka suddenly exploded with excitement. But my dear boy, he cried out, that means you've won! He rushed out of the elevator and started shaking Charlie's hand so furiously it nearly came off. Oh, I do congratulate you, he cried. I really do. I'm absolutely delighted. It couldn't be better. How wonderful this is. I had a hunch, you know, right from the beginning. That is, it was going to be you. Well done, Charlie. Well done. This is terrific. Now the fun is really going to start. But we mustn't dilly. We mustn't dally. There's even less time to lose now than there was before. We have an enormous number of things to do before the day is out. Just think of the arrangements that have to be made, and the people we have to fetch. But luckily for us, we have the great glass elevator to speed things up. Jump in, my dear Charlie, jump in. You too, Grandpa Joe, sir. No, after you. That's the way. Now then, this time I shall choose the button we are going to press. Mr. Wonka's bright, twinkling blue eyes rested for a moment on Charlie's face. Something crazy is going to happen now, Charlie thought. But he wasn't frightened. He wasn't even nervous. He was just terrifically excited. And so was Grandpa Joe. The old man's face was shining with excitement as he watched every move that Mr. Wonka made. Mr. Wonka was reaching for a button high up on the glass ceiling of the elevator. Charlie and Grandpa Joe both craned their necks to read what it said on the little label beside the button. It said, "Up and out." Up and out, thought Charlie. What sort of room is that? Mr. Wonka pressed the button. The glass doors closed. "Hold on!" cried Mr. Wonka. Then wham! The elevator shot straight up like a rocket. "Yippee!" shouted Grandpa Joe. Charlie was clinging to Grandpa Joe's legs, and Mr. Wonka was holding onto a strap from the ceiling. And up they went. Up, straight up this time, with no twistings or turnings, and Charlie could hear the whistling of the air outside as the elevator went faster and faster. "Yippee!" shouted Grandpa Joe again. "Yippee! Here we go!" "Faster!" cried Mr. Wonka, banging the wall of the elevator with his hand. "Faster! Faster! If we don't go any faster than this, we shall never get through." "Through what?" shouted Grandpa Joe. "What have we got to get through?" "Aha!" cried Mr. Wonka. "You wait and see. I've been longing to press this button for years, but I've never done it until now. I was tempted many times. Oh, yes, I was tempted. But I couldn't bear the thought of making a great big hole in the roof of the factory. Here we go, boys. Up and out!" "But you don't mean," shouted Grandpa Joe, "you don't really mean that this elevator—" "Oh, yes, I do," answered Mr. Wonka. "You wait and see. Up and out!" But it's made of glass," shouted Grandpa Joe. "It'll break into a million pieces." "I suppose it might," said Mr. Wonka, cheerful as ever. "But it's pretty thick glass all the same." The elevator rushed on, going up and up and up, faster and faster and faster. Then suddenly, crash! And the most tremendous noise of splintering wood and broken tiles came from directly above their heads. And Grandpa Joe shouted, "Help! It's the end! We're done for!" And Mr. Wonka said, "No, we're not. We're through. We're out." Sure enough, the elevator had shot right up through the roof of the factory and was now rising into the sky like a rocket, and the sunshine was pouring in through the glass roof. In 5 seconds, they were 1,000 feet up in the sky. "The elevator's gone mad!" shouted Grandpa Joe. "Have no fear, my dear sir," said Mr. Wonka calmly, and he pressed another button. The elevator stopped. It stopped and hung in mid-air, hovering like a helicopter, hovering over the factory and over the very town itself, which lay spread out below them like a picture postcard. Looking down through the glass floor on which he was standing, Charlie could see the small, faraway houses and the streets and the snow that lay thickly over everything. It was eerie and frightening to be standing on clear glass high up in the sky. It made you feel that you weren't standing on anything at all. "Are we all right?" cried Grandpa Joe. "How does this thing stay up?" "Candy power," said Mr. Wonka. 1 million candy power. "Oh, look," he cried, pointing down. "There go the other children. They're returning home." The other children go home. "We must go down and take a look at our little friends before we do anything else," said Mr. Wonka. He pressed a different button, and the elevator dropped lower, and soon it was hovering just above the entrance gates to the factory. Looking down now, Charlie could see the children and their parents standing in a little group just inside the gates. "I can only see 3, he said. "Who's missing?" "I expect it's Mike TV," Mr. Wonka said. "But he'll be coming along soon. Do you see the trucks?" Mr. Wonka pointed to a line of gigantic covered vans parked in a line nearby. "Yes," Charlie said. "What are they for?" "Don't you remember what it said on the golden ticket? Every child goes home with a lifetime supply of candy. There's 1 truckload for each of them, loaded to the brim." "Aha!" Mr. Wonka went on. "There goes our friend Augustus Gloop. Do you see him? He's getting into the first truck with his mother and father." "You mean he's really all right?" asked Charlie, astonished. "Even after going up that awful pipe?" "He's very much all right," said Mr. Wonka. "He's changed," said Grandpa Joe, peering down through the glass wall of the elevator. "He used to be fat. Now he's thin as a straw." "Of course he's changed," said Mr. Wonka, laughing. "He got squeezed in the pipe. Don't you remember? And look, there goes Miss Violet Beauregard, the great gum chewer. It seems as though they managed to deduce her after all. I'm so glad, and how healthy she looks. Much better than before." "But she's purple in the face," cried Grandpa Joe. "So she is," said Mr. Wonka. "Ah, well, there's nothing we can do about that." "Good gracious!" cried Charlie. "He's skinny after going through the pipe."
얘가 제일 성공했네.
He succeeded very much.
그렇지.
And look at this. Look at this. He needs new pants.
Look at poor Veruca Salt and Mr. Salt and Mrs. Salt.
They're simply covered with garbage. "And here comes Mike TV," said Grandpa Joe. "Good heavens! What have they done to him? He's about 10 feet tall and thin as a wire." "They've overstretched him on the gum stretching machine," said Mr. Wonka.
How very careless. "But how dreadful for him!" cried Charlie.
"Nonsense," said Mr. Wonka. "He's very lucky. Every basketball team in the country will be trying to get him. But now," he added, "it is time we left these 4 silly children. I have something very important to talk to you about, my dear Charlie." Mr. Wonka pressed another button, and the elevator swung upwards into the sky. Charlie's Chocolate Factory. The great glass elevator was now hovering high over the town. Inside the elevator stood Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe, and little Charlie. "How I love my chocolate factory," said Mr. Wonka, gazing down. Then he paused, and he turned around and looked at Charlie with a most serious expression on his face. "Do you love it too, Charlie?" he asked. "Oh, yes," cried Charlie. "I think it's the most wonderful place in the whole world." "I'm very pleased to hear you say that," said Mr. Wonka, looking more serious than ever. He went on staring at Charlie. "Yes," he said, "I am very pleased indeed to hear you say that, and now I shall tell you why." Mr. Wonka cocked his head to one side, and all at once, the tiny twinkling wrinkles of a smile appeared around the corners of his eyes, and he said, "You see, my dear boy, I have decided to make you a present of the whole place. As soon as you are old enough to run it, the entire factory will become yours." Charlie stared at Mr. Wonka. Grandpa Joe opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "It's quite true," Mr. Wonka said, smiling broadly now. "I really am giving it to you. That's all right, isn't it?" "Giving it to him?" gasped Grandpa Joe. "You must be joking." "I'm not joking, sir. I'm deadly serious." But why should you want to give your factory to little Charlie?" "Listen," Mr. Wonka said. "I'm an old man. I'm much older than you think. I can't go on forever. I've got no children of my own, no family at all. So who is going to run the factory when I get too old to do it myself? Someone's got to keep it going, if only for the sake of the Oompa Loompas. Mind you, there are thousands of clever men who would give anything for the chance to come in and take over from me. But I don't want that sort of person. I don't want a grown-up person at all. A grown-up won't listen to me. He won't learn. He will try to do things his own way and not mine. So I have to have a child. I want a good, sensible, loving child, one to whom I can tell all my most precious candy-making secrets while I am still alive." "So that is why you sent out the golden tickets?" cried Charlie. "Exactly," said Mr. Wonka. "I decided to invite 5 children to the factory, and the one I liked the best at the end of the day would be the winner." "But Mr. Wonka," stammered Grandpa Joe, "do you really and truly mean that you were giving the whole of this enormous factory to little Charlie? After all—" "There's no time for arguments," cried Mr. Wonka. "We must go at once and fetch the rest of the family. Charlie's father and his mother and anyone else that's around. They can all live in the factory from now on. They can all help run it until Charlie is old enough to do it by himself. Where do you live, Charlie?" Charlie peered down through the glass elevator at the snow-covered houses that lay below. "It's over there," he said, pointing. "It's that little cottage right on the edge of the town. The tiny little one." "I see it!" cried Mr. Wonka, and he pressed some more buttons, and the elevator shot down towards Charlie's house. "I'm afraid my mother won't come with us," Charlie said sadly. "Why ever not?" "Because she won't leave Grandma Josephine and Grandma Georgina and Grandpa George." "But they must come too." "They can't," Charlie said. "They're very old, and they haven't been out of bed for 20 years. "Then we'll take the bed along as well, with them in it," said Mr. Wonka. "There's plenty of room in this elevator for a bed." "You couldn't get the bed out of the house," said Grandpa Joe. "It won't go through the door." "You mustn't despair," cried Mr. Wonka. "Nothing is impossible. You watch." The elevator was now hovering over the roof of the Bucket's little house. "What are you going to do?" cried Charlie. "I'm going right on in to fetch them," said Mr. Wonka. "How?" asked Grandpa Joe. "Through the roof," said Mr. Wonka, pressing another button. "No!" shouted Charlie. "Stop!" shouted Grandpa Joe. Crash went the elevator, right down through the roof of the house into the old people's bedroom. Showers of dust and broken tiles and bits of wood and cockroaches and spiders and bricks and cement went raining down on the 3 old ones who were lying in bed, and each of them thought that the end of the world was come. Grandma Georgina fainted. Grandma Josephine dropped her false teeth. Grandpa George put his head under the blanket, and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket came rushing in from the next room. "Save us!" cried Grandma Josephine. "Calm yourself, my darling wife," said Grandpa Joe, stepping out of the elevator. "It's only us." "Mother!" cried Charlie, rushing into Mrs. Bucket's arms. "Mother, Mother, listen to what's happened. We're all going back to live in Mr. Wonka's factory, and we're going to help him to run it, and he's given it all to me. And... "What are you talking about?" said Mrs. Bucket. "Just look at our house," cried poor Mr. Bucket. "It's in ruins." "My dear sir," said Mr. Wonka, jumping forward and shaking Mr. Bucket warmly by the hand, "I'm so very glad to meet you. You mustn't worry about your house. From now on, you're never going to need it again anyway."
"Who is this crazy man?"
screamed Grandma Josephine.
"He could have killed us all."
"This," said Grandpa Joe, "is Mr. Willy Wonka himself." It took quite a time for Grandpa Joe and Charlie to explain to everyone exactly what had been happening to them all day. And even then, they all refused to ride back to the factory in the elevator.
"I'd rather die in my bed,"
shouted Grandma Josephine.
"So would I,"
cried Grandma Georgina. "I refuse to go," announced Grandpa George. Oh my God, he's pushing the bed into the elevator. So Mr. Wonka and Grandpa Joe and Charlie, taking no notice of their screams, simply pushed the bed into the elevator. They pushed Mr. and Mrs. Bucket in after it. Then they got in themselves. Mr. Wonka pressed a button. The doors closed. Grandma Georgina screamed, and the elevator rose up off the floor and shot through the hole in the roof, out into the open sky. Charlie climbed onto the bed and tried to calm the three old people who were still petrified with fear. "Please don't be frightened," he said. "It's quite safe, and we're going to the most wonderful place in the world." "Charlie's right," said Grandpa Joe. "Will there be anything to eat when we get there?" asked Grandma Josephine. "I'm starving. The whole family is starving." "Anything to eat?" cried Charlie, laughing. "Oh, you just wait and see." The end.